Hello there, Seraphim17 once again. This is my Mass Effect Andromeda Insanity difficulty video walkthrough. We're going to be hunting the Archon, and as is quite ubiquitous in this game, you're going to be following the waypoint that's going to be taking you through the ship, through some various activities, and then it's going to be leading us to the planet that we're on right now, which, I believe, is it Kadara, this one, I think? This is the one where the people who didn't get on with the Nexus, kind of, the outlaws and everything, come to this place, and it's very colourful, very interesting looking, and it's one of my favourite areas. But as with a lot of the areas in Andromeda, I feel like it's underused. So, because we're first here, I know there's a couple of spots in this zone that give you 100 Milky Way points, and I want to use those to upgrade the Scorpion that I'm going to be using later on. So as I'm perusing around this this new culture here that we have, this seedy underworld kind of mobland, I'm going to be trying to pick up as many points as I can while attending to the new shops before we go to the new objective. And there is a hub world below this as well, where you can talk to a few people, and there is a secret merchant kind of thing. But I'm not going to be dabbling too much with that, because we'll just be doing, of course, the story elements and then getting on with the game. But these are long videos, these guys, and I'm probably going to be cutting them up midway through, because I don't really want a full-hour video on the channel. It can be very intimidating to watch. And for a walkthrough, because it contains so much different moments that people might be looking for, it also makes it difficult to find what you want. But it affords me the luxury of being able to talk about some interesting topics. And I want to kind of embellish upon the idea of coming to these different colonies, coming to these different planets and bringing stability. Because as our role in the initiative, as the Pathfinder, is to find new homes. That's kind of the point of it. And you go to these locations, you kind of gift wrap them, and you make them all presentable, you get them all gentrified, and then your team swoops in and drops an outpost there, and Addison thanks you, Tan generally says something quite sharp, and that's the goal of the game. You've colonized this certain part of this certain location, and now humanity is, not all shitting in the same toilet, which is fantastic, but the gameplay implications are less interesting. Because when you think of something like this, it's a pretty bold idea. It gives you this notion that you might have some kind of management to do, some kind of, simulation and resource to keep on top of, but there isn't really anything like that. You go to all this work, and I say work, it's generally do a bunch of sundry tasks that are not the most interesting, but occasionally there can be something worthwhile. There's generally one interesting mission on each of the lists before you can put an outpost down, because it involves some kind of inevitable betrayal, some kind of, ooh, these criminals nicked this thing, one of your friends knew about this thing, knew about another guy, and it turned out he was betraying them, and all that kind of, general mystique, thriller-esque script design when it comes to the events in the game. But everything else is space Sudoku, meaningless fetch quests, going back and forth for tedious reasons holding Y. Let's face it, it's not going to change your life. It gives you experience, and that's one of the pros to take away from it, but it's just relatively uninteresting. And you do all of these things, and sometimes it only takes, an hour or two, other times it might take a bit longer, depending on what they have you doing. And you establish this outpost, and you've done what you set out to do on that planet. You've put humanity's footprint onto this planet, or the Milky Way footprint is probably a better way of saying that, because there's a lot of races, isn't there, coming forward here, although some of them are severely underrepresented, because there's about 5 or 6 races from the Mass Effect universe that aren't even in this game, which I think it definitely gives it an emaciated feeling when half the people that built the previous culture that made Mass Effect so rich and interesting are kind of not represented. But you get this outpost, and then they don't do anything. And I don't really understand why the impetus is so large on this idea of making these outposts. And then when you get an outpost, you might get a couple of sundry tasks off a few of the residents. You get to talk to the person in charge of it who's going to be monitoring it for you. And then generally there might be one shop that opens up. But that's it. There's no meetings where you talk about the direction that the agriculture is going to go, the direction where the research goes, the science, the military presence, or any of that. At the beginning of the game, there's a very important mission where they ask you, is this going to be a scientific outpost or is this going to be a military outpost? And whatever you do here sets out quite a grand sweeping idea of what you're all about, because it's your first statement as a presence in this new system. And on my first run I picked science because I thought it was going to give me some kind of invention, you know, some kind of benefit as far as technology went. And I didn't really notice a damn difference. I didn't even see anything. All I saw was a little bit of a dialogue where people were being like, if we get attacked by the cat, we're going to need military, and all you have is scientists. All you've done is proliferate another attack and increased our vulnerability. And it's like, oh my god, the inevitability of this conversation. Ooh. And then on this walkthrough, because it was my second time through... By the way, guys, we're just following objectives here to talk to a prisoner. It's all simple stuff. You're not going to need me to tell you what to do here, guys. Follow your waypoint, trust it. Even though it can be a little bit glitchy at times, because it tells you that something is above you and the opposite direction to where it actually is. So just be warned, it can be drunk sometimes. But on this playthrough, I picked military, hoping it'd give me an advantage with my weapons. It'd unlock maybe a new tier in the shop, a new tier in upgrades. You know, somehow give me a benefit for picking military, perhaps a new skill, perhaps some passives. And I didn't see a damn thing. And admittedly, I might have missed it. I might have missed the subtlety. There's a lot of stuff in this game that you can read, and in honesty, I've skipped most of it. The first time through, I was trying to get through the game really quickly so that I could make a walkthrough for it, because I knew it was going to be pretty challenging and people would need it, and I wanted to do that. But the second time through, I read everything. And about halfway through the game, I stopped reading things because they stopped being interesting. Like, I don't think I read a single thing that was anywhere near as interesting as the stuff I read in the other games. And I used to read the entire codex. I used to read every computer terminal in the previous Mass Effects because I wanted to enjoy the world. They crafted and envisioned such an interesting location, and the world building was fantastic. In this game, it doesn't have the same hook, and I'm not going to blame it on the writing, even though there is some, you know, admittedly awkward writing. I'm just going to blame it on the fact that maybe it's just not delivered in a format that hooks me the way the other games did. You know, some things are not meant for everybody, and maybe that's what it is for me. And maybe that's where the difference is, you know, when you do those choices. Maybe it's reflected in the pseudo-politics that you get delivered via the data pads, or maybe on the Nexus if you mess around with a couple more of the side quests. Maybe it's reflected in different ways. But you would think when there's... At the beginning of the game, when you turn it on and it's loading, it's your choices as Ryder have consequences, and it's trying to instill this idea that what you do matters and what your choices are matter. But so far, other than scars on people's faces, I haven't really seen much of a repercussion of anything. Like, the choices don't really matter. They're all so inconsequentially small that you'd have to be really self-absorbed and solipsistic to even care, really, in the grand scheme of things. You know, when you're talking about a universe, like, one of the choices they give you is to cheat in a race against Vetra by jumping up a cliff using your boosters. It's like such a silly thing. Like, I don't get it. And it kind of exacerbates the idea of the Renegade and Paragon points being completely absent from the game. In the previous games, you were able to choose to be good or bad, and both playthroughs generally wrought different repercussions depending on your actions, and some of them were pretty dark, some of them were, you know, pretty flat, but for the most, you felt like the way you conducted yourself gave your character a purpose in that world. People either feared you or they liked you, and you could use it to get what you wanted or to help folks, depending on how, you know, you approached each scenario. I was an arsehole. Love being an arsehole in Mass Effect. Love just shooting people before the conversation ends. Love all that stuff. And then this game gives you all these kind of half-assed, lame equivalents of that, where you can, like, punch somebody and do this and do that, and none of it has the same bite or the same, you know, lasting factors or any of the ripples that the previous events had. So it makes it feel almost like a really cheap imitation. And even in Mass Effect, you know, those areas could have been stronger, because some of them were great, but a lot of them were just kind of like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll push him off the building randomly. You know, they could have developed it a lot more, because it was a pretty shallow mechanic that essentially gave you red eyes or blue eyes, but, you know, those red eyes were beastly. Whereas in this game, I feel like we have all these advances in technology, all these advances in systems, all these advances in the competition that have been making these kind of games while Mass Effect has been absent, and I don't feel like they've seized on it at all. You know, when you compare it to a system like the Nemesis system, where you've got all this incredible intrigue of warring factions and people growing power and weakening and overthrowing regimes, and this is all happening just ambiently because that's the way the world calculates itself, and then you affect it by, you know, destroying powerful figures in that hierarchy. When you have a system such as that, you'd think they'd really go into this idea of either being good or bad and those moral repercussions or those political repercussions, because this has always kind of been, even if it's a little bit on the lighter side, you know, it's space politics in a lot of ways. A lot of it is pissing contests and race, you know, differences and xenophobia and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of intriguing themes that these games can do, and I feel like this one kind of just skirted it in a lot of ways. They skirted it into, you know, everybody's best friends, and every so often there's a moment where it gives you a glimpse that it could have been a lot more intriguing. But of course that isn't to say that you won't enjoy it. There are a lot of enjoyable moments in some of the side quests and some of the missions and some of the sundry activities that you can get up to. A lot of them have you going to a place in these big open worlds that you've not been to before, and then there's an encounter with some enemies, and then you read some information, and it turns out that there's, you know, perhaps there's two different scientists who are pissed off at each other, and one person's telling you that they're making a drug, the other person's saying that that person was making it just as much as they were, but now they got scorned, and there's a little bit of, you know, the ambiguity there on the moral side, and it can be really fun. And I do think people will enjoy it. It's just when you compare it to the legacy of what spawned it, you would think after 5 years and quite a you know, it's a nice budget, that they could have come up with something that was deserving of the Mass Effect name. And I think a lot of people are going to see weaknesses in here, because it's just inevitable. The game has some interesting parts to it, but I definitely find myself in Mass Effect 1. I always go back to Mass Effect 1 because it's the one I enjoyed the most. Like in Mass Effect 1, I did everything in that game because I wanted to just uncover the world. I wanted to learn things and know things, and I wanted to immerse myself. It's a bit how I feel about Titanfall 2, which might sound like a strange contrast if anybody's played it. But Titanfall 2 has all this rich fiction and all this established world, and almost no way to learn more about it. But because it looks so interesting, and there's all this preset, you know, fiction behind it, all this grounding lore, I want to know more. I want to know why this is like this, why that is like this. I want to see what this is and that is, and there's all these parts of it that I find really intriguing, and all of it is just essentially a premise to set up an online shooter. And that doesn't mean that there hasn't been, you know, thought put into it, or a lot of love put into certain aspects, or creativity. It just means that it was all being motivated by this driving factor of humans shooting each other in an arena. So they don't really have to go too nuts with it. But there's so much intriguing stuff in that I don't even think they touched on in the campaign. I think the campaign was a little bit light in contrast to a lot of the established stuff in the multiplayer. And I'm just talking about, you know, conversations that the NPCs have, some of the things that they reference, some of the names of all the factions and the corporations and stuff. And it's like, who are these people? What motivates them? What does this world look like when it's not at war? You know, all those kind of interesting things that I think really drew people into something like Mass Effect. And it creates an environment where you want to live in it, you want to be part of it, and you want to see it. I think this game lacks that a lot. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's, you know, as a lot of people would have you believe, if it's just, you know, it's a bad game, it's a crap Mass Effect, it's 2 out of 10, it's all this stuff. Like, there's a lot of really, there's a lot of vitriol, let's face it. A lot of venom, a lot of people really displeased with this game. And for good reason, too. You know, I'm not going to just completely ignore the struggle that people are having with it, because it is probably the worst Mass Effect. It is a weaker game. But when people are giving it, like, 4 out of 10, it makes me wonder if these people have played shit like Vampire Rain. Because a lot of games nowadays get 6s in reviews. It's just kind of like, oh, it's a shit game, give it a 6.